This is Your Bird Story, a broadcast of bird stories told by everyday people about their interactions and relationships with wild birds in cities. This season is funded by the Voice for Nature Foundation. I'm your host, Georgia Silvera Seamans. Welcome to another episode of Your Bird Story. I'm here with Nate Swick, and I'm going to ask that Nate introduce himself to you all.
My name is Nate Swick. I live in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I am the Education and Digital Content Coordinator for the American Birding Association, which is sort of a fancy title, but a lot of people know me as the host of the American Birding Podcast. I've written a couple books about birding, and I've sort of been in the birding world for a while now.
Where were you before ABA?
It's funny. I've had kind of an odd employment history. I've done a lot of sort of odd jobs in science and education. When I first moved to North Carolina, almost 20 years ago this summer, I took some research-related jobs at the big academic institutions here as sort of a tech. Did work on infectious disease clinics. I did some science with that, and also for a long-term heart study, basically as sort of the data wrangler communications person for those. And then I got on at the Moorhead Planetarium in Chapel Hill, which is as an educator, and helped arrange field trips and help prepare those for all the kids that come to the planetarium to watch the shows. And I've worked at museums and as a teacher assistant in the public schools. And I eventually, sort of in a roundabout way, ended up at the ABA doing the stuff that I do now after kind of building my way up through the organization, doing social media and communications and stuff. And it sort of fell into this podcast gig, which has sort of been the center of my responsibilities with the ABA we've been doing the podcast for 7 years now.
Did your interest in birds start with your position at ABA, or did it precede your current position?
It preceded it by quite a bit. I've been a birder or a naturalist for a really long time, since I was a young kid. My dad was a middle school science teacher, and so we were kind of a very outdoorsy family. I grew up along a river and spent a lot of time out on it, floating in canoes and on flotation rafts and whatnot, catching turtles and snakes and bugs and all sorts of stuff. And I was always interested in nature and identifying the things around me, and birds just were part of that. We had field guides in the house that I looked through as a young person and enjoyed, putting a name to the stuff I was seeing at our bird feeders. I've been interested in birds for a really long time. I never really thought of it as a career path. I sort of fell into that. I was sort of had a generalized science track through college. Wasn't really sure what I was going to do with it. And I started writing about birds on my own on a blog that I hosted called The Drinking Bird. This is pre-social media, so there were a lot of people, kind of out there writing about birds online, and I was part of this really cool community of a lot of different people from all over the world. At that time, the ABA was going through kind of a leadership crisis, a president that had not stayed on very long, and they were kind of in a hard way. And one of the things I'd noticed as being a member of the American Birding Association and as a follower of what they were doing for a long time was that they really didn't have much of an online presence. And I thought that was really important. This was in the 2000s when everyone was going online, magazines were going online and all that stuff. And I really felt like the ABA was missing the boat on that. So I wrote on my blog, I essentially wrote a post called ABA Hire Me that basically said, I could do this for you. I would be happy to help. Bring me on as part-time and I'd be happy to do what I can do. And the new president, Jeffrey Gordon, took me up on it. And I started as a part-time contract employee, in addition to some other stuff I was doing. And then over the years, it just kind of turned into a full-time gig, and here I am.
Wow. Listeners, take note. You can write your own job. What are some of the topic subjects that you wrote about on your blog? And do you miss it?
A little bit. I enjoyed writing a lot. I thought that the process of kind of working that stuff through my head, when I started writing on that blog, I really didn't think there were very many people reading. It was just sort of an exercise for myself to kind of categorize what I was seeing when I would go birding on the weekends and just my thoughts about what was going on in the birding world. Just as it is today, the ivory-billed woodpecker was a topic of conversation. That hasn't changed much in 15, 20 years. There's stuff about bird names and just kind of funny stuff that would pop up. It's funny, the way the blogs worked back then, for people who may not remember those kind of days before Facebook. We were kind of talking to each other. There are all sorts of blog carnivals where people would collect links and you would find all sorts of other kind of like-minded people. And yeah, whenever I'd go out birding, I'd just kind of think about what I wanted to write about, talk about a bird that I'd seen, talked about the experience that I'd had at local birding spots. And it was sort of for me to get into the practice and habit of writing. And I found that really productive. I wish I could say that it was, a lot of exciting content. I don't know that it really was. If I went back, I would probably see like, oh, I went to Mason Farm today and saw blue grosbeak and indigo bunting. But, that meant something to me.
I mean, well, those are fabulous birds to see.
Oh, no doubt.
Do you have a favorite bird?
Birders always get this question. I'm never exactly sure how to answer it because there's so many birds out there and I love all of them. But I did finally come to the conclusion that there was one bird that I see every once in a while that I'm always just really happy to see and I really enjoy seeing. And it's probably yellow-breasted chat. I live in the Southeast. You go to the right sort of habitat, you're likely to at least hear a chat, even if you don't see them. Sometimes they can be really difficult to see, but I just think they're really funny. They're kind of goofy, gangly birds, and they have a really cool display where they do this weird kind of slow flap up into the air, and they look really funny when they do it. And they make all sorts of really wonderful noises. And that is a bird that whenever I see it, that will make my day. So I would probably say that's my favorite bird.
Where would one go looking for this chat?
So around here, they like kind of second growth, overgrown fields. So if you've got like an old pasture that maybe the farmer no longer puts cattle out to it and it lets things like cedars and sweet gum grow up into it and kind of get this kind of low 10 to 15 foot, very sparse kind of meadow with a lot of woody vegetation. That's the place I always look for chats. Tangles, it's usually kind of hot because there's not a lot of tree cover. Go to one of those places and just listen for that song. And then, if you hear that, and then you can hear them doing all their little weird cat calls and whines and really wonderful singing bird, even if it is not in any sort of pattern or rhythm. It's just sort of all over the place.
I was going to ask you for vocalizations, so I'm glad you did that spontaneously.
Oh, yeah. They respond pretty well to it. So if you go out there and you hear one and you can do like that, and sometimes they'll come in and they'll yell at you for a little bit and then you can get a decent look at them. A lot of times they kind of hang, I don't know, a foot and a half below the top of the trees. And so they can be really sneaky. Like, they're in there, you can hear them, but you can't always see them. It's really endearing.
I feel that way about cardinals.
Yeah.
I know you're there.
And you see them and it's like, oh yeah, there it is. That's fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. You've talked to a lot of different kinds of bird people on the podcast. What are some of your favorite bird facts?
We get a lot of bird facts from people. I try to cast a really wide net when I'm looking at people who I want to talk to. Part of that is because it's a weekly podcast and there's just like a lot of content that needs to be fed. So I can't be particular about who I talk to. I think there's a lot of really cool ways that people engage with birds. And as long as people have that connection to birds, then that's someone that I'm going to enjoy talking to. I really love weird facts about birds that I feel like I know really well. And I talked to a woman who was doing research on American robins, which is a bird that, everyone in North America is somewhat familiar with. And it feels like they know them hopping around on their lawns or in public parks. But she was doing this cool research where she was putting trackers. And I think that adding these sort of GPS trackers to birds that we think we know is like this amazing way of learning all these little secret things about the birds that we think we're familiar with.
We spoke with biologist Emily Williams about her research into American robins' migratory behavior. Listen to our conversation in our September 2022 episode.
She was following these robins around using these trackers, and she was finding that these individual birds that you think are there for the whole year are actually traveling these amazing distances, and some of them are traveling like across the country. And if you look at like the total mileage of the distance that these birds are traveling, it's actually a farther distance than some of the birds that we think of as like migratory birds, like warblers and grosbeaks and stuff. Like the robins are traveling farther than those birds are during the year, but we don't really think about it because we see robins year round. And we just think that that bird that we see in July is the same bird maybe that we see in April, but it's not. It's could be a bird from thousands of miles away that came to your yard. I just found that to be really amazing.
That is.
Yeah.
I know, it's like you should never take your everyday birds for granted, right?
You can't at all, because they're doing amazing things. We all know about the long distance migrants and the bar-tailed godwits that shrink their stomachs to fly across the Pacific Ocean in one go. And that's amazing. Don't get me wrong. But some of the birds that we have in our backyards are doing incredible things too. And the whole world is more wild and bizarre than we could ever possibly imagine, I think. And birds are sort of a window into that world.
Sort of continuing with that, is there something that you would like to know about a particular bird or birds in general that science currently doesn't know?
I do really like learning where birds are going. Like I said, when we put those trackers on them, when we figure out that they're traveling far more than we imagine, I'd like to know what's going on in some of these places that we can't get to, that are difficult to get to, like the Thayer's gulls. So recently, I guess it was about 5 years ago, the birds that we thought of as Thayer's gull, which is a kind of common Western gull, and Iceland gull, which is this kind of northeastern cool Arctic gull, were determined to be one species, and they named them all Arctic gull. But like they're very different, the birds that we see on the East Coast and the birds that we see on the West Coast. And there's got to be something happening up there in the Arctic, up in Nunavut, where the two populations come in contact with each other, because we see these weird kind of intergrade birds too, but we don't really know why. And it probably wouldn't be feasible to send someone up there in the middle of the summer because there's nothing else there. Like, who's going to pay for that study? But we don't know. We don't know what's going on. We don't know how these two populations interact with each other. We don't know why some birds look like this and some birds have white wingtips and some birds have black wingtips and some have like kind of weird grayish wingtips in the middle. Like, we've assumed that that's from where they overlap, but we don't really know. And there are parts of the world that we can't get to easily, that there are birds that are interacting with each other and with their environment in ways that, I don't know, maybe we can never find out. And that's also like pelagic species, like ocean-going species. Because when you think about it, the ocean is really just one big habitat. And we underestimate their ability to travel between those habitats because all we can do is get out on a boat, a little tiny boat on the middle of the ocean, and hope that a bird intersects with us. And how many are not? What's going on out there that we will never know? It's a mystery. And I really enjoy when people are trying to solve those mysteries, even if they're not solvable.
Yeah, there's something special about not being able to know everything about a particular organism.
I think so too. Yeah.
But that said, maybe this requires you to restart your blog and
maybe I should. Funny story. Like, I used to pay for the domain name, like thedrinkingbird.com. When I stopped blogging, I was like, oh, you know what? I'll get rid of the domain name. What could happen? And it immediately got pounced on by like some Japanese company. And now if you go to thedrinkingbird.com, it's like they're selling. So I don't know what it is. I can't translate it. But yeah, it's still out there on like .wordpress.com. But unfortunately, all the links don't work anymore.
Okay. Well, for folks who want to see it, then maybe they have to do the internet Wayback Machine.
Yeah, you probably will. The link's out there. I go to it every once in a while because some of the stuff that I've written about, even 10, 15 years ago, has some relevance to what I'm doing now with the podcast. And sometimes I'll go back to those thoughts I had back then and kind of update them, which is kind of cool to see where I was in my head that, 15 years ago. So
yeah. What's the most recent thing you've updated?
There's been talk a lot about common names, and particularly common names of birds that are named after humans, and whether or not that's a good way to go about naming birds for a lot of different reasons. It's sort of got a lot of attention in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly with the changing of McCown's longspur to thick-billed longspur, which I think is a positive thing, changing that name. Not only is the name more descriptive, which is useful when you're identifying the birds, but John McCown was a Confederate general and We're absolutely need to reevaluate our relationship with those things. So, it's sort of expanded to this idea that maybe we need to change all those common names. I wrote about this like 10 years ago, basically from the perspective of like, I do not find these names useful. Like if I'm a beginning birder, I don't know who Cooper is and why he has a hawk. It's not really helpful to help me identify this bird from a sharp-shinned hawk or a red-shouldered hawk or any other bird that I'm trying to figure it out. Like from an objective perspective, bird names that use descriptions of the bird or the habitat or what the bird sounds like are more useful names for those of us who are trying to work their way through it. And that was the sort of take I came to. And that's still sort of the foundation of why I feel these names need to be changed. I hope we come to the place where we get to come up with new names for those birds, because that's the fun part. Coming up with new names is fun for birds that, take into account the way people interact with birds now, which is fundamentally different than the way that people interact with birds 150 years ago when they got these names.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, having an evocative name is so useful when you're first learning about birds. Yeah. As you said, Cooper's hawk, that tells me
nothing.
Nothing.
It's a hawk. Yeah, but something like pine warbler. Oh, that's great. Exactly. Go to pines. The bird is found in pines. It's highly associated with pines where I live in the Southeast and most everywhere else. And it's a great name.
Red-tailed hawk. Hello.
Yeah, perfect.
So you are the author of a couple of books. One is devoted to birds of the Carolinas. Mm-hmm. And the other one is devoted to folks who are just entering the sort of bird watching scene. Could you talk about why you decided to write both books, in particular the one about beginning birding?
It's kind of funny. I kind of fell into the opportunity to do that. I had been writing on my own blog for a while, and I had started writing as part of the team on 10,000 Birds, which is a big bird blog that still exists. The publishers of that book went to Mike Bergen and Corey Finger, who are the hosts of 10,000 Birds, and said, we're interested in coming up with a book about bird watching and entry-level bird watching. And they tried to work through a way that made them both happy. And they, for whatever reason, they couldn't come to a decision on how they were going to approach that. And so they said, well, Nick can do it. And so they kicked it down to me. And I was like, well, all right, how do I want to talk about how to bird? I went all the way back to kind of the beginning of my own interest in birds and kind of talked about how I approach birding. I know that there's a lot of different books out there for people who are interested in learning how to approach birding. Pretty much every birder who is known in some capacity has a book like How to Bird, Entry-Level Guide to Birding, that sort of thing. But I really feel like there really can't be too many of those kind of books, because just like every student, learns differently from every different teacher, every person who approaches this question sort of has a different take on it and a different strategy. And sometimes one strategy is not going to resonate with someone, but the more people out there talking about it, they're going to find someone who resonates with them. And so I kind of talked about how I go about identifying birds when I'm out there. But the main premise that I wanted to let people in on is that birding to me is this sort of augmented reality. I mean, people go through their normal worlds without really paying attention to what's going on in the natural world. And for me, having these birds around in my everyday life is like this sort of magical reality that is on top of my everyday reality. Like knowing that the birds that are in the tree in my backyard have traveled thousands of miles to get there. That's amazing. And it's not something that people aren't going to even recognize unless they get into birds. And so letting people know that birds are everywhere. You don't have to go somewhere to enjoy birds. You can enjoy birds wherever you are. They're doing cool things wherever you possibly could be. It was really important to me when I started talking about this book. And then for every chapter, there's sort of an activity that's associated with it, even something as simple as like write down what you see, write down how birds sound to you, download eBird, things like that. But I wanted to give people something they could take with them for every chapter. So for one chapter, I'll talk about habitats, and then the activity will be something as simple as go somewhere different, somewhere that's not in your backyard, someplace that looks slightly different, and see if you can see different birds there. I want them to be accessible, because I think birds should be accessible. People can enjoy it no matter how far down that path you really want to go. I think birding has suffered a little bit from people thinking there's only one way to bird, and it's like a ladder that you have to climb, and you have to go up every single rung that eventually peaks out at like identifying subadult gulls on a beach somewhere. it's like a house or an apartment building or whatever. And if you want to go all the way to the top and stay there, you're welcome to do that. But if you want to go halfway up and you want to just identify the birds in your backyard that are coming to your feeders, by all means, call yourself a birder. We need more people calling themselves birders because that's a perspective changing sort of event, and it gets people caring about conservation, which I think is the ultimate goal. So I want people to feel comfortable with birding the way they want to bird and enjoying birds at whatever level I don't even want to call it a level, like whatever way they want to enjoy them. There's no such thing as a bad way to enjoy birds.
That observation that birding is perspective changing, that feels really, I don't know, profound to me. It makes me think of sort of the dominant way that I engage with birds is through sight. I am not a good ear birder, and I feel that there would be a sensory shift if I could really develop that skill. So I'm curious for you, since you have devoted a chapter about bird sounds and hearing bird vocalizations and then creating a sound map, what are some, like, one or two things that folks should think about if they want to really focusing on the vocalization aspect of birds?
Yeah, it's tough because I think that for the visual aspect, we have a shared language to talk about how birds look that I think a lot of people sort of intuitively understand, but we don't really have that language when we talk about how birds sound, especially because, hearing can be such a subjective thing as well. One person can hear a northern cardinal sing and they can hear cheer, cheer, dearie, dearie, and another person can hear laser guns from Star Wars. Like, we have different ways of approach. Yeah, we have different ways of approaching this. And I think that's hard for a field guide author to focus on the way that they approach things, knowing that people are going to hear things slightly differently, because that's just the nature of humanity. I guess it comes down to finding a field guide that works for you, or a field guide author that is explaining things in the way that works for you. I come from a musical background. I'm a musician as well. And so I think of things a lot of the times as like lines on a staff, like musical notes on a staff. I think that helps me a lot. I really like sonograms, which are sort of these visual representation of bird songs, because they look like music. It looks like music to me. It's when the sonogram goes up, the bird is singing higher. When it goes down, it is singing louder. When it's closer together, it's like a ch-ch-ch-ch-ch. If it's longer, like a cardinal, for instance, we're going to keep using cardinal as an example. It's just like long, straight lines because they're so clear and bright. That's kind of how I look at it. I don't know. I think people really have to do this on their own. And that's one of the things I suggested in the book, is to like draw what you hear, right? So if you hear a cardinal, this is hard because podcasting is as an auditory medium, so you can't see what I'm doing. But if you're drawing on your hand, like if you hear a cardinal go, for me, it's like up, 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 down, 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 like you're drawing lines. And I think kind of illustrating that in that way is really helpful for people to kind of understand what a bird song looks like, and so you can start using some of those visual language tools to describe audio. But it's hard. I'll just frankly say, like, it can be hard, and it takes practice, and it just takes repetition. Frankly, just like assaulting your ears with the same thing over and over and over again until you get it. I wish there was an easy way to do it, but it's a journey, and you start one place, and the next year you realize you've moved a little ways down that path, and you get a little bit better at it. Yeah, it can be tough, because there's just no language to talk about it in the way that we talk about how birds look.
Do you think that writing the book, would you describe that as a learning experience for you in terms of learning more about birds?
Yeah, for sure. And even something like the field guide, which is, pretty straightforward, formulaic sort of style of writing, but you can't make every single chapter or every single species account the same. You have to mix it up a little bit, and it forces you to get inside your head and think, well, how do I really identify these birds? Because some birds, some common species, like you know a friend, and so you don't really think about how you identify them. You just know a Carolina chickadee. You just know a tufted titmouse, and having to sit down and think of it, go all the way back to the beginning. How does someone who has never even heard of a chickadee, maybe titmouse, a lot of people have heard of chickadees, they like to put them on like little cutesy paintings and cups and stuff, but of someone who's never even heard of a titmouse or a nuthatch, how do they experience this bird? How can you put this in words? That was really fun, because it forced me to rethink what I knew about birds that I thought I was really familiar with. And it's a really useful exercise, I think, for anyone, even if you're not writing a field guide to kind of describe those birds in ways that hopefully a person apart from you will understand. And that way, people who are leading bird walks or showing people birds, they do this all the time too. And it's really effective. I think you kind of knowing what you know, being able to step back and kind of look at the pedagogy of it is really useful for a birder to, advance to move down that birding path.
The idea of, I saw this bird, I'm going to list it as seen, and then, I saw this bird, and maybe I'm going to take some quick notes about the things that will make me know that it's that bird the next time I see that bird.
Yeah. In that sense, a bird, and I don't know, in another sense, you sort of understand that bird. Those little subtle clues are really useful when you're identifying them too, because you don't always identify a bird based on what it looks like. You identify a bird based on what it's doing. That's stuff that's not always in a field guide, or it's written out, but experiencing that can be really helpful. Like watching kinglets kind of flick their wings around when they're foraging. Well, even if you don't see that bird well, and you see a little bird up there flicking its wings, ruby-crowned kinglet.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Those birds are hard to get.
They're hard to get a look at, for sure. Yeah. So you need to lose all those sort of supplementary cues to identify it a lot of times.
Is there a bird that you're looking forward to seeing? Well, I guess we're in the middle of it. It's already started, fall migration. Yeah. Is there a species you're looking forward to seeing?
I live in the Southeast, so a lot of the birds that come down in the South are birds that we see throughout the rest of the winter. I really enjoy seeing like the first kinglet of fall. Usually shows up in late September. I enjoy like the first real cold front of the year, not only because it can be sort of oppressively hot down here, and the fall is such a lovely season in the Southeast, but it also brings things like our first white-throated sparrows and other sort of migrant sparrows, blue-headed vireos, things like that kind of come down right after that first fall push. That's my favorite birding, is in the fall, partly because it, as you said, it's starting and it lasts like 6 months, so it's like half the year, but also because it's leisurely birding, and you don't feel like you're missing things like in spring when everything just blows past in a blur of color and sound. And it falls kind of, you go out when it's sunny, when it's nice, because that's when the bugs are going to be active and that's when the birds are going to be active. So you eat a little more, you don't have to get up quite as early. There's a lot of little fun things going on in fall that I really enjoy. But when the kinglets come and the sparrows first arrive, then I know that it's really hitting.
I mean, I just want to point out to folks that even in that answer, looking, when you talked about the chat, talking about habitat, the sort of fall season of birds, and talking about the warm, sunny day, the presence of insects.
Yep.
So there are all of these layers that are important
for sure.
Clues, bits of information that's going to get you moving further on your pathway of birding.
Yeah. And as you do it more and more, you kind of figure these things out. And sometimes you have help from a birder that will help you, give you little tips. I remember this, one of the most kind of revelatory bits of insight I ever had to someone that told me was that when you're birding in fall after a particularly cold evening, the morning comes, and in the Southeast sometimes we get very cold nights and then it's very hot during the day. But like that very cold snap when kind of the bugs get knocked down close to the ground, and then the next morning when you go out and you have a choice of where to go birding. Let's say you're looking towards a shaded path, or you're looking towards a place where the sun is hitting. You want to always follow the sun, because after a cold snap, as soon as those plants that the sun is starting to hit, that's when the bugs are going to start getting active, and that's when all the birds are going to start hitting those buggy parts of the trees. So things like birch trees and tulip trees that put out like a lot of little seeds that bugs life. Oh, the birds will just be all over that stuff. And things like goldenrod. Goldenrod is like a bird magnet in the fall. Like, find a goldenrod patch and just sit there for a while and watch all the birds coming in. It's particularly birds that you think of as birds that will stay up at the tops of the trees, like warblers. They'll come down close to the ground and forage in the goldenrods. It's a really satisfying experience, and a great way to see those birds that, might just be flashes of belly and undertail in the spring.
Well, because it's audio, folks can't see the sort of enthusiasm on your face when you were just describing that.
I love it. That's my favorite kind of birding, is like finding a nice big goldenrod patch in like late September, early October. You're going to see so much stuff there. It's really cool. Feels
Okay,
like
so
magic.
folks, you got to learn your plants too.
That's right. Yeah. It helps. I'm not much of a plant person, but I know a handful of stuff, and you learn the stuff that the birds like for sure.
Yeah. Well, Nate, thank you very much.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Always love talking birds.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Your Bird Story. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you back here next month.